September 12, 1942, the sun climbs over Charter Towers Airfield in Queensland, Australia, and the heat already shimmers off the runway like liquid glass. A Douglas A-20 Havoc rolls toward a shelter built from nothing but corrugated metal, and the kind of hope that keeps men standing when everything else has fallen. Inside that makeshift hangar, there's a man, 43 years old, hands stained black with engine grease, eyes burning with something that looks like rage but runs deeper, something closer to love twisted into fury. His name is Paul Irvin Gunn, but nobody calls him that. They call him Pappy. And in less than 6 hours, the bomber he's been tearing apart and rebuilding with his bare hands is going to hit a Japanese airfield at Buna in New Guinea. If what he's done works, if the guns he's mounted and the metal he's welded hold together under the stress of combat, then American bombers will finally have the firepower they need to rip Japanese convoys apart, to turn their airfields into graveyards, to make the enemy bleed. If it fails, men die. And Pappy Gunn becomes the fool who wasted time and resources chasing a dream that never had wings. But failure isn't what keeps him awake at night. It's not what drives his hands to keep working until they crack and bleed. What drives him is this: his wife, Clara Louise, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Connie, Julie, and little Paul Jr. They're trapped 1,700 miles north in a Japanese internment camp at Santo Tomas in Manila, living behind wire, starving slowly, and there's not a damn thing he can do to reach them except kill as many of the enemy as possible and pray it ends the war faster. He's thinking about last week, watching a Japanese convoy slip past American forces because no aircraft could get low enough, slow enough, deadly enough to stop them. He's thinking about how a medium bomber, something designed to release its payload from 12,000 feet in the thin, cold air where pilots feel safe, might be transformed into something the Japanese have never encountered before. A low-level monster that can strafe ships until they burn, suppress anti-aircraft fire until the gunners are dead at their posts, and turn enemy positions into smoking craters. This isn't a story about technology, not really. It's about a man, a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who understood machines the way some men understand music, who had nothing but wrecked fighter planes, hand tools, and a father's desperation, and who turned America's medium bombers into the most terrifying gunships the Pacific had ever seen. This is about improvisation defeating engineering, about necessity giving birth to innovation that would echo through generations of warfare, about how one man's fury, his absolute refusal to accept that his family would die in that camp, transformed aluminum and guns and raw determination into a weapon that helped shatter an empire. The sound of engines warming up rolls across the airfield. The smell of aviation fuel hangs heavy in the humid air, and somewhere in the distance, a war is waiting. The North American B-25 Mitchell was never meant to be a killer. Not like this anyway. When it first rolled off the assembly line at the North American Aviation plant in Inglewood, California back in 1941, it was built as a medium bomber, a workhorse designed to carry substantial bomb loads with reasonable efficiency and drop them with moderate accuracy from altitudes between 8 and 12,000 feet. Twin Wright R-2600 engines, 64 feet from nose to tail, wingspan stretching 95 feet, loaded weight around 33,000 pounds, maximum speed of 230 miles per hour, range of 1,300 miles. It was solid, reliable, thoroughly tested. They named it after Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, the prophet of air power who proved back in 1921 that aircraft could sink battleships, a man who saw the future of war before anyone else believed him. The Mitchell carried a crew of 6, pilot and co-pilot up front, bombardier and navigator, radio operator, 2 gunners watching the sky for fighters. Its defensive armament included a tail gun, a dorsal turret, and a ventral gun tray that took almost a full minute to extend. And by the time it was down and ready to fire, a Japanese Zero could make 3 separate attack runs. The waist guns posed nearly as much danger to the Mitchell's own vertical stabilizers and engine nacelles as they did to enemy fighters. The fields of fire were that restricted. The aircraft was conventional. It was orthodox. It was thoroughly inadequate for the kind of war being fought in the jungles and coral islands of the Southwest Pacific in 1942. Down there, in the green hell of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, altitude was a luxury American bomber crews could rarely afford. The jungle environment made medium-level bombing almost pointless. Flying at 10,000 feet, a bombardier might spot a ship through the canopy, might see an airfield or a supply dump, but actually hitting it through dense vegetation while anti-aircraft fire burst around the aircraft and Zeros dove from above, that was another matter entirely. Bombs dropped from altitude scattered like seeds. Many vanished into the jungle without detonating. Others splashed harmlessly into water. The few that found targets often caused minimal damage because they lacked the precision to strike anything vital. Meanwhile, Japanese supply convoys ran every night, sustaining isolated garrisons, reinforcing threatened positions, delivering troops and equipment throughout their sprawling Pacific empire. American submarines were taking a toll, yes, but submarines couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't patrol every shipping lane, couldn't interdict every barge and transport. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a way to hammer these convoys from the air, to deny the Japanese the freedom of movement that geography seemed to grant them. They needed aircraft that could fly low, loiter over targets, suppress defensive fire, and deliver devastating attacks against ships and shore installations. But here's the problem. No such aircraft existed in the American inventory in mid-1942. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra had the speed and maneuverability for low-level attacks, but they lacked the range, lacked the punch, lacked the survivability to sustain operations against well-defended targets. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, not ship-busting at wave-top height. Light bombers like the Douglas A-20 Havoc showed promise, but they were in desperately short supply. The B-25 Mitchell was available in increasing numbers, but it was designed for a completely different mission profile, built for a different kind of war. What the 5th Air Force needed was an aircraft that combined the range and payload of a medium bomber with the forward-firing punch of a fighter. They needed something that could approach targets at wave-top height, suppress anti-aircraft fire with streams of heavy machine gun fire, and then either strafe the target to pieces or skip-bomb it with 500-pound bombs released so low they'd bounce across the water like flat stones before slamming into ship hulls below the waterline. They needed a gunship, and they needed it in weeks, not months, not years, because every week of delay meant more Japanese supply runs, more reinforced positions, more dead American and Australian soldiers on jungle battlefields, where air support meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Enter Major General George C. Kenney, who arrived in Australia in August 1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Kenney was 53 years old, a veteran of the First World War, a man with absolutely no patience for orthodoxy when orthodoxy was getting his men killed. He immediately began touring his scattered bases, looking for solutions to the tactical problems that were bleeding his bomber force white. And at Charter Towers Airfield, south of Townsville in Queensland, he found something interesting: an aging, grease-stained former Navy pilot in his early 40s, working in a tin shelter on a Douglas A-20 Havoc, converting it from a light bomber into something else entirely. Paul Irvin Gunn, called Pappy by everyone who knew him because at 43 he was ancient by Air Force standards, was unlike any officer Kenney had ever encountered. Gunn had enlisted in the Navy back in 1918, served 21 years as an aviation mechanic, and then as a naval aviation pilot. Retired in December 1939 as a chief petty officer. He was an expert in low-level flying, a gifted aircraft mechanic. A man who understood airplanes the way a blacksmith understands iron, because he could shape them with his hands, bend them to purposes their designers never imagined. After leaving the Navy, Gunn had moved his family to the Philippines, where he helped start Philippine Airlines, flying 5 privately owned Beechcraft aircraft on cargo and passenger routes throughout the islands. And when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Gunn was in Manila. Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately commandeered Philippine Airlines aircraft and personnel. Gunn was sworn into the Army Air Corps as a captain, given command of a makeshift air transport squadron, and ordered to evacuate military personnel from Japanese-held territory. For the next 6 weeks, Gunn flew mission after mission into hostile airspace in unarmored Beechcraft planes, bringing out pilots, ferrying supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, performing feats of low-level flying that earned him a reputation as either the bravest or the craziest pilot in the Philippines, probably both. He survived being shot down once, crashed into a coconut plantation, was rescued by the plantation owner, someone he'd flown as a passenger during peacetime. The kind of small miracle that happens in war sometimes. Eventually, in late January 1942, Gunn flew one of the last aircraft out of the Philippines to Australia, carrying key personnel to safety. But he left something behind, the only thing that mattered. His wife, Clara Louise, and their 4 children were trapped in Manila when the city fell. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese rounded up American and Allied civilians and interned them at the University of Santo Tomas, and Pappy Gunn's family would remain prisoners there for 3 years, living on starvation rations, subject to brutal discipline, slowly wasting away while he fought from Australia, unable to reach them, unable to protect them, able only to kill as many Japanese as possible in the desperate hope that ending the war faster might save their lives. This was the man General Kenny found working on an A-20 in a tin shelter at Charter Towers in August 1942. This was the man who, when asked what he was doing, explained that he was installing 4 50-caliber machine guns into the bombardier's nose, replacing the transparent plexiglass with solid metal, transforming the light bomber into a low-level strafer that could suppress anti-aircraft fire and tear enemy aircraft and installations to pieces. Kenny asked where Gunn had gotten the machine guns. Gunn explained that he was scavenging them from wrecked fighters scattered across Australian airfields, P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras, damaged beyond repair but with functional weapons. The 5th Air Force supply of 50-caliber machine guns was severely limited throughout the Southwest Pacific. There were never enough, so Gunn did what any good mechanic does. He improvised. He found wrecks, salvaged guns, fabricated mounts, tested, adjusted, tested again. Made it work because making it work was the only option. General Kenny was impressed. This old sailor understood something that headquarters staff in comfortable offices never would. That war is not won by following procedures but by solving problems, and that the best solutions often come from people who know their tools intimately enough to bend them to new purposes. Kenny immediately placed Gunn on his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him a simple mandate: convert more aircraft, make them deadlier, do it fast. Gunn set to work with a fury that astonished everyone around him. He wasn't just an engineer solving a technical problem. He was a father trying to save his family by shortening a war. And every aircraft he modified, every sortie that aircraft flew, every Japanese ship sunk or airfield destroyed brought the war closer to Manila, closer to Santo Tomas, closer to his wife and children. Fury is a powerful motivator. Desperation is an even more powerful engineer. By early September 1942, Gunn had converted several A-20s into strafers. The modifications were crude but effective. 450-caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the nose, solid metal panels replacing the bombardier's transparent station, additional ammunition storage, bomb racks modified to carry parachute fragmentation bombs, small bombs slowed by parachutes so the attacking aircraft could escape the blast radius even at ultra-low altitude. The parafrag bombs would float gently down over enemy airfields and installations, exploding above parked aircraft and fuel dumps, showering them with red-hot fragments and white phosphorus that set fire to everything the fragments touched. The converted A-20s were tested in combat on September 12, 1942, in a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea, and the results exceeded every expectation. Flying at wave-top height and treetop level, the strafers roared in before defenders could react, suppressing anti-aircraft fire with streams of 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds, then releasing their parafrag bombs directly over the target. Japanese fighters caught on the ground exploded. Fuel dumps detonated, buildings disintegrated. The lightly constructed Japanese aircraft, built for agility and range, not armor, tore apart under the half-inch bullets traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The strafers pulled up and away, leaving behind a trail of destruction that looked like the wrath of an angry god. And General Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to do the same thing to the B-25 Mitchell. This was a bigger challenge. The A-20 was a light bomber, relatively small, relatively easy to modify. The B-25 was a medium bomber, larger, more complex, with different aerodynamics and structural considerations. Adding weight to the nose of an aircraft affects its center of gravity, which affects its stability and handling. Installing guns creates recoil forces that must be absorbed by the airframe. Modifying a bomber designed for high-altitude level flight to perform low-level strafing runs meant accepting risks that no engineer at North American Aviation would have approved. But Pappy Gunn didn't work for North American Aviation. He worked for General Kenny. And General Kenny didn't care about what the manual said was possible. He cared about what needed to be done. Gunn was assisted by Jack Fox, a North American Aviation technical representative based at Charter Towers. Fox sent drawings of Gunn's proposed modifications back to the factory in Long Beach, California. But there were too few B-25s in the theater to spare any for modification experiments yet. The first B-25s were needed for conventional bombing missions. Gunn would have to wait for more aircraft to arrive before he could begin the conversions that would define the rest of the Pacific Air War. The waiting was agony. Every day meant more supply runs, more reinforcements, more American soldiers dying on jungle battlefields, more time his family spent in that camp. So Gunn flew combat missions himself, testing his A-20 conversions, refining the tactics, proving the concept. He flew more missions than almost any other man in theater, accumulating combat hours and enemy kills, earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and eventually 9 Purple Hearts, 9 separate wounds, 9 times he bled in combat, and kept flying. By late 1942, B-25 Mitchells were arriving in Australia in greater numbers. General Kenny authorized Gunn to begin the conversion program. And working with a small team of mechanics, Gunn established a B-25 conversion center at Townsville. The modifications were extensive. Remove the transparent bombardier's nose, replace it with solid metal panels, install 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in the nose, 4 in underwing blisters or fuselage packages. Some aircraft received additional guns, 2 more forward-firing guns in cheek blisters on either side of the nose, bringing the total forward-firing armament to 10 or even 12 heavy machine guns. Add the dorsal turret's twin guns, which could be synchronized to fire forward with the fixed guns. And some B-25s could bring 14 50 caliber machine guns to bear on a target simultaneously. 14 50 caliber machine guns. Each gun fires 850 rounds per minute. Each round a half-inch diameter armor-piercing projectile traveling at 2,900 feet per second. 14 guns equaled 11,900 rounds per minute, nearly 200 rounds per second, creating a cone of destruction so dense that anything caught within it simply disintegrated. The conversions took time, weeks, not overnight. Not a single desperate night of improvisation, but a sustained program of modification and testing. Each aircraft had to be carefully modified to maintain structural integrity. The guns had to be aligned, tested, adjusted. Ammunition feed systems had to be installed and debugged. Pilots had to learn new tactics for an aircraft that now handled differently, weighed more in the nose, required different flying techniques to compensate for the weight of all those guns and all that ammunition. But the results, when they came, were devastating. The first squadron of Strafer B-25s was ready for combat in early 1943, and they would prove their worth in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, one of the most one-sided victories in the history of naval aviation, a battle that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that Pappy Gunn's jury-rigged gunships had changed the Pacific War forever. The first days of March 1943, intelligence reports reached General Kenny's headquarters in Port Moresby. New Guinea, a Japanese convoy, is assembling at Rabaul, 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops. Escorted by 8 destroyers, destination Lae, New Guinea, where Japanese forces are under pressure from Allied advances. The convoy represents a massive reinforcement effort, enough troops to turn the tide of the ground campaign, enough supplies to sustain Japanese resistance for months. And General Kenny knows what he has to do. The convoy must be destroyed, not damaged, not delayed, destroyed. Every ship, every soldier, every ton of supplies, because if those 7,000 troops reach Lae, American and Australian soldiers will pay for it in blood on jungle battlefields where the enemy already holds every advantage terrain can provide. Kenny has the aircraft to do it. He has B-17 Flying Fortresses for high-altitude bombing. He has B-25 Mitchells, both conventional bombers, and Pappy Gunn's Strafer conversions. He has A-20 Havocs similarly modified. He has P-38 Lightning fighters for escort and strafing. And he has a new tactic that's been tested in smaller engagements, but never against a target this large. This well-defended, this important, skip bombing. The concept is simple in theory, terrifying in execution. A bomber approaches its target at extremely low altitude, 200 feet or less, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves. At point-blank range, perhaps a quarter mile from the target, the bomber releases its bombs with a slight upward trajectory, and the bombs skip across the water like flat stones thrown by children at a pond. Except these stones weigh 500 pounds and contain high explosives. They skip once, twice, then slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline. Exactly where naval architects know a ship is most vulnerable. The explosion opens the hull to the sea. The ship floods. The ship sinks. But skip bombing requires pilots to fly directly at heavily armed warships through walls of anti-aircraft fire, low enough that a single mistake means hitting the water and disintegrating, slow enough that enemy gunners have time to aim, close enough that if the bomb detonates prematurely, the attacking aircraft gets caught in its own blast. It requires nerves of steel and perfect timing. It requires aircraft that can suppress the anti-aircraft fire long enough for the bomber to release its ordnance and escape. It requires Pappy Gunn's Strafer B-25s. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea begins on March 2, 1943. The Japanese convoy departs Rabaul, steaming southwest through the Solomon Sea toward the Huon Gulf and Lae. Australian reconnaissance aircraft spot the convoy and shadow it. Reporting position and course, General Kenny mobilizes his air groups. Bombers and fighters take off from bases throughout New Guinea and northern Australia. The weather is terrible. Heavy clouds, rain squalls, poor visibility. But the weather works in the Allies' favor, allowing aircraft to approach unseen until the last moment. The first attacks are conventional. B-17 Flying Fortresses bomb from altitude on March 2nd and 3rd, scoring few hits but forcing the convoy to maneuver constantly, slowing its progress. Then the weather clears on the morning of March 3rd, and Kenny unleashes the Strafers. The modified B-25s and A-20s come in low, so low that their propellers are churning spray from the wave tops. They approach in formation, a wall of aircraft bearing down on the convoy at 200 miles per hour. The Japanese ships see them coming. Anti-aircraft guns open fire. 20mm and 25mm cannons throw up walls of explosive shells. Heavier 40mm guns pump rounds in arcing trajectories. The sky fills with tracer fire, with black puffs of exploding shells, with the smoke and fury of desperate defense, and then the strafers open fire. 14 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously, thousands of rounds per second hammering into Japanese ships, and the effect is apocalyptic. Anti-aircraft gun crews are scythed down where they stand. Gun shields are perforated like paper, bridge windows shatter, superstructures are shredded. The armor-piercing rounds punch through light armor, ricochet off steel bulkheads, tear through wooden structures, set fires, detonate ammunition. The Japanese gunners who survived the initial onslaught find themselves suppressed, unable to aim, unable to fire, forced to take cover as half-inch bullets tear apart everything around them. And in that window of suppressed fire, the skip-bombing B-25s and conventional Mitchells release their loads. 500-pound bombs skip across the water. Some miss. War is never perfect, but many hit. They slam into hulls below the waterline. They explode with the force of half a ton of high explosive concentrated against the weakest part of the ship's structure. Steel plates buckle, welds fail, the sea pours in. The transport ships, heavily laden with troops and supplies, are particularly vulnerable. They're not warships. They don't have armored hulls or sophisticated damage control. When the bombs hit, when the hulls open to the Pacific, they begin sinking immediately. Troops below decks, trapped in compartments that are flooding, have nowhere to go. The ships settle lower in the water, list to one side, then capsize or break apart and slide beneath the waves. The destroyers fare better. They're warships, designed to take punishment, but even they cannot withstand the coordinated assault. One destroyer takes a bomb amidships and breaks in half. Another is so riddled with 50-caliber fire that it becomes unmanageable, drifting in circles as fires rage unchecked. A third destroyer, trying to rescue survivors from a sinking transport, is caught by strafers and turned into a funeral pyre. The battle continues for 3 days, every time the Japanese try to rescue survivors. Allied aircraft appear, every time a damaged ship tries to limp away. It's attacked again. The Straffer B-25s hunt like wolves, working in coordination with conventional bombers, with fighters, with reconnaissance aircraft spotting targets. They use the parachute fragmentation bombs, floating them down over the decks of destroyers, killing exposed personnel, starting fires, creating chaos. They strafe lifeboats and debris fields, not out of cruelty, but because those survivors are soldiers who, if rescued, will fight again on New Guinea's battlefields. By March 4th, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is over, and the results are staggering. All 8 transport ships sunk. 4 destroyers sunk, 3 others heavily damaged. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers killed in the sinking ships or in the water. Fewer than 1,000 reach land, and most of those are immediately captured or killed by Allied forces. The reinforcement effort is annihilated. The supplies that were supposed to sustain the Japanese garrison at Leh for months are at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses: 4 aircraft shot down, 13 aircrew killed or missing. It is one of the most one-sided victories in the history of warfare. And at the center of it, making it possible, are Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s, the strafers that suppressed defensive fire, that allowed the skip bombers to approach, that tore Japanese ships apart with concentrated machine gun fire. General Kenny immediately orders more conversions. Word spreads throughout the theater. Other air forces want the strafers. The 13th Air Force sends B-25s to Brisbane for conversion. Depot engineers at Townsville begin modifying aircraft. The 10th Air Force in India picks up the modifications. What began as one man's desperate improvisation in a tin hangar in Queensland becomes standard practice across the Pacific. But the story doesn't end with tactical success. Because North American aviation back in California has been watching, the factory representatives have been sending reports about Gunn's modifications. Engineers in Long Beach have been studying the results, and they've begun incorporating Gunn's innovations into new production models. In late 1943, North American introduced the B-25G model. The transparent nose is gone, replaced by a solid metal nose housing a 75mm M4 cannon. A tank gun mounted in an aircraft, firing 3-pound high-explosive shells that can engage ships from 2 miles away and sink smaller vessels with a single hit. 4 50-caliber machine guns supplement the cannon. The concept is innovative, the execution is problematic. The 75mm cannon produces tremendous recoil. Each time it fires, the entire aircraft shudders. Pilots struggle to keep the aircraft stable. The cannon is manually loaded, slow to reload. Quickly exhausts its limited ammunition supply after 7 weeks of combat. Units equipped with the B-25G have expended all their 75mm ammunition. The cannon-armed Mitchells are an interesting experiment, but ultimately prove less effective than Pappy Gunn's simpler solution: more machine guns. The B-25H model appears next, 1,000 aircraft built with even more machine guns. The 75mm cannon is replaced with a lighter 14-gun version, 8 in the nose, 4 in side blisters, 2 in the dorsal turret. Some H models also carry rockets, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that can be ripple-fired in devastating salvos. But the ultimate expression of Pappy Gunn's vision is the B-25J. Introduced in 1944, North American builds over 4,000 J models. Many are delivered with transparent noses for conventional bombing. But the air depot system creates conversion kits, the Strafer nose option. When a J model is converted to a Strafer, it carries 18 50-caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in fuselage packages, 2 in the dorsal turret, 1 in each waist position, 2 in the tail. 14 of those 18 guns fire directly forward. 18 50-caliber machine guns on a single aircraft, 15,300 rounds per minute combined rate of fire, over 250 rounds per second. A B-25J Strafer firing all forward guns simultaneously puts more lead into the air than an entire infantry company could fire with their rifles. And the effect on targets is not destruction, it's disintegration. These heavily armed Mitchells continue to devastate Japanese targets throughout New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa until the end of the war. They strafe airfields, destroying parked aircraft. They attack bridges, severing supply lines. They hunt coastal barges and small vessels. They support ground troops with devastating close air support. They are so effective that captured enemy documents warn Japanese forces not to attack when the strafers are overhead. Weapons are useless against them, and attacking will only draw their fury. The Strafer crews develop their own tactics and their own reputation. They fly low enough to see the expressions on enemy soldiers' faces. They approach from unexpected angles, over mountains, up valleys, along coastlines. Using terrain to mask their approach until the last second, they work in coordination with each other. One aircraft suppressing fire while another delivers the killing blow. They are feared, they are hated, they are merciless, and behind every one of those aircraft is Pappy Gunn's desperate fury. Channeled into engineering, transformed into lethality, Major Gunn, promoted for his innovations and his combat record, is eventually sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of the new B-25 variants at North American Aviation. It's a recognition of his contributions, an acknowledgement that his field modifications have been so successful they need to be incorporated into production aircraft. But Gunn doesn't want recognition. He wants to be in the Pacific, fighting, killing Japanese, shortening the war that holds his family hostage. He returns to the Pacific as soon as he can, He continues flying combat missions. He continues taking risks that make his commanders nervous. And in late 1944, a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in the Philippines catches him on the ground. He's wounded, his 9th Purple Heart, badly enough that he's removed from active combat. The war continues without him, but by then, the strafer program he pioneered is so thoroughly integrated into Pacific air operations that it no longer needs him. In February 1945, American forces liberate Manila. They fight house to house, building to building, against fanatical Japanese defenders who would rather die than surrender. And on February 3rd, American troops reach the University of Santo Tomas. They find over 3,000 internees, starving, sick, traumatized by 3 years of captivity. And among them are Clara Louise Gunn and her 4 children. Pappy Gunn is reunited with his family. They're alive, barely, malnourished, traumatized, forever marked by their ordeal, but alive. The war he fought to shorten, the modifications he made, the missions he flew, the Japanese he killed, all of it was for this moment. His family survives. The Philippines are liberated. The war grinds toward its conclusion. Gunn retires from the Army Air Forces as a full colonel on June 30, 1948. Medically retired due to his accumulated wounds, he returns to the Philippines to rebuild Philippine Airlines, the airline he helped start before the war. The company expands, provides flights across the South Pacific, becomes one of the region's major carriers. Gunn flies again, not in combat, but in commerce, carrying passengers and cargo instead of guns and fury. On October 11, 1957, Colonel Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn dies when his chartered Beech 18 crashes in a storm over the Philippines. He's 57 years old. He survived 21 years in the Navy, 5 years of brutal combat in the Pacific War, 9 combat wounds, countless close calls, and the loss of nearly everything he cared about during the dark years when his family was imprisoned, and a storm over the islands he loved finally claims him. But his legacy endures. The strafer concept he pioneered doesn't die with him. During the Korean War, modified B-25s provide close air support using the same tactics Gunn developed. The principle, heavy forward-firing armament on a stable platform, becomes doctrine. In the 1960s, when the United States begins developing gunships for Vietnam, the engineers look back at Pappy Gunn's work. They study his modifications. They understand his insight that sometimes the best weapon isn't the newest or the most technologically advanced, but the one that puts the most firepower exactly where it needs to be. The AC-47 Spooky, the first modern gunship, uses sideways firing guns and a pylon turn, a different approach than Gunn's forward-firing strafers, but the same understanding that transport and bomber aircraft can be converted into devastating gunships. The AC-130 Spectre, still flying today with 105mm howitzers and sophisticated targeting systems, is a direct descendant of Gunn's vision. Take an aircraft designed for one purpose, modify it for another, create a weapon so effective it changes how wars are fought. Every Air Force close air support doctrine written since the 1940s acknowledges, implicitly or explicitly, that Pappy Gunn was right, that desperation can produce innovation, that field modifications can outpace factory design, that the side willing to improvise, to break rules, to transform its tools into weapons its enemies have never seen, holds an advantage that technology alone cannot provide. The irony is profound and multi-layered. A bomber designed to drop ordnance from altitude becomes a low-level strafer. A former Navy pilot, retired and running a civilian airline, becomes one of the most innovative weapons designers of the war. An aircraft modification program born from desperation and scavenged parts becomes the foundation for gunship doctrine used for 80 years. A man fighting to save his family helps destroy an empire. And perhaps the deepest irony, the B-25 Mitchell, which Pappy Gunn modified so dramatically, was never supposed to be a close air support aircraft. It was supposed to deliver bombs from medium altitude. It was supposed to be safe, orthodox, conventional, But orthodoxy doesn't win wars. Innovation does. Desperation does. Fury channeled into engineering. The morning of September 12, 1942, Pappy Gunn's modified A-20 attacked Buna. The raid succeeded beyond all expectations. But Gunn wasn't celebrating. He was already planning the next modification, the next improvement, the next innovation. Because every day the war continued was another day his family spent in that camp. Every sortie his aircraft flew, every enemy position his modifications destroyed, brought the end closer. War is often portrayed as a story of grand strategy, of decisive battles, of great commanders moving armies like pieces on a chessboard, but wars are also won in tin hangars in the Australian heat, by middle-aged former sailors with grease under their fingernails and fury in their hearts, by men who understand that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is simply being willing to look at an aircraft, a perfectly good, conventional, orthodox aircraft, and ask, what if we added more guns? And Pappy Gunn asked that question. He answered it with a wrench and a welding torch. And the Japanese Empire paid the price in blood and steel at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The B-25 Mitchell flew in every theater of the Second World War. It participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. It bombed targets across Europe, Africa, and Asia. It served with distinction in dozens of air forces around the world. Nearly 10,000 were built. It was reliable, it was versatile, it was loved by its crews, but in the Southwest Pacific, the Mitchell was something more. It was a gunship. It was a ship killer. It was a terror weapon that forced the Japanese to abandon daylight supply runs, to scatter their convoys, to accept that American air power could reach them anywhere, anytime, and turn their ships into funeral pyres. And all of it, the tactics, the modifications, the victories, traces back to one man who refused to accept that his family's imprisonment was inevitable, who refused to accept that the war would last as long as orthodox thinking suggested, who refused to accept that aircraft had to be used the way their designers intended. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn didn't invent the gunship overnight in a moment of desperate improvisation. He developed it over months of trial and error, testing and refinement, combat experience, and engineering insight. But he did it faster than any official program could have. He did it with salvaged parts and improvised solutions. He did it because he had to, because every delay meant his family suffered. Because Fury is a powerful engineer when channeled through skill and determination. The Strafer B-25s weren't perfect. They were nose-heavy. They handled differently than conventional Mitchells. The recoil from firing all those guns simultaneously was violent enough to slow the aircraft noticeably. Ammunition consumption was enormous. A Strafer could expend its entire load in seconds of sustained fire. The aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire because they flew so low. Crews died, aircraft were lost. War is never clean, never easy, never without cost, but the Strafers worked. They changed the Pacific War. They allowed American forces to interdict Japanese supply lines, to support ground troops with devastating precision, to destroy enemy installations before defenders could respond. They saved lives, American, Australian, and Allied lives, by shortening battles, by preventing reinforcements from reaching embattled garrisons, by giving ground forces the air support they desperately needed. And every time a Strafer B-25 dove toward a Japanese ship or airfield, every time those 14 machine guns opened fire and the target disintegrated under concentrated fire, it was Pappy Gunn's fury made manifest. It was a father's desperation transformed into engineering. It was improvisation defeating orthodoxy. It was proof that sometimes the best solutions come not from careful planning, but from having no other choice. The Pacific War ended on August 15, 1945. With Japan's surrender, Pappy Gunn's family was free. The Strafer B-25s had helped bring that moment closer. How much closer? Impossible to calculate. But every ship sunk, every airfield destroyed, every battle shortened contributed to the cumulative pressure that forced Japan to accept the unacceptable. Wars are won by many factors: strategy, logistics, industrial production, courage, sacrifice, but they're also won by individuals who see problems and solve them, who refuse to accept limitations, who transform ordinary tools into extraordinary weapons. And Pappy Gunn was such an individual. His contribution to victory wasn't a single decisive battle. It was hundreds of modifications, thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of enemy casualties inflicted by aircraft he transformed. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a good aircraft. Pappy Gunn made it a great one, not by sophisticated engineering or advanced technology, but by asking a simple question: what does this aircraft need to do the job that needs doing? And the answer was more guns. More forward-firing heavy machine guns capable of suppressing enemy fire and destroying targets with overwhelming firepower. So he added more guns. He added them with wrenches and welding torches, with salvaged parts and improvised mounts, with ingenuity born of desperation and refined through combat experience, and the result changed warfare. 80 years later, the United States Air Force still operates gunships based on principles Pappy Gunn pioneered. The platforms are different: turboprop transports instead of piston-engine bombers. The weapons are more sophisticated: cannons, howitzers, precision-guided munitions. The targeting systems use radar, infrared sensors, computers that would have seemed like magic to Gunn's generation. But the fundamental insight remains unchanged. A transport or bomber aircraft, properly modified, can deliver sustained, devastating firepower against ground targets with a precision and intensity that other platforms cannot match. Every AC-130 gunship pilot owes a debt to Pappy Gunn. Every close air support controller calling in fire from circling gunships is using tactics refined in the skies over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. Every innovation in aerial gunnery stands on foundations Gunn laid in a tin hangar in Queensland, working with hand tools and fury. And this is not the story of advanced technology defeating primitive enemy equipment. The Japanese were not unsophisticated. Their aircraft were excellent. Their ships were well armed. Their pilots were skilled and courageous. They understood warfare as well as anyone. But they didn't have Pappy Gunn. They didn't have a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who understood aircraft intimately enough to transform them, who was desperate enough to try unconventional solutions, who was furious enough to work 18-hour days modifying bombers because every hour of delay was an hour his family spent in captivity. The Japanese fought bravely. They fought skillfully. They fought with everything they had, but they couldn't adapt as fast as Gunn could innovate. They couldn't counter tactics they'd never seen before. And when those strafer B-25s came in at wave-top height, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water toward their hulls, all the courage and skill in the world couldn't save them. The sky darkens over the Pacific. The sound of engines fades into memory. Somewhere a father holds his children again after 3 years of wondering if he'd ever see them alive. Somewhere the wreckage of Japanese ships rests on the ocean floor, monuments to the power of desperation. And somewhere in the history of warfare, written in fire and steel and the determination of one man who refused to accept defeat, is the truth that sometimes the difference between winning and losing isn't technology or numbers or strategy. It's simply the willingness to look at what you have and make it into what you need. No matter what the manual says, no matter what anyone thinks is possible. And Pappy Gunn looked at a medium bomber and saw a gunship. He looked at salvaged guns and saw salvation. He looked at an impossible war and decided he would end it faster. One aircraft at a time, one mission at a time, until his family came home. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. The memories of World War II remind us not only of the price of freedom, but of the strength of the human spirit. Let us preserve their stories so they are never forgotten. Please subscribe to help keep these memories alive.